All right, kia ora. Not used to having the lights. My name is Adam Hyde. Here to curate this session, just as a little heads up on what we're going to cover. I'm from Coco, and we build systems to support different types of publishing, and so we're very fascinated with emergent publishing models. And I think you can view scholarly publishing as largely being various eras, E-R-A, of innovation that have forced new ways of working. And I think largely a lot of the pressure for this comes from researchers themselves. And I think probably the most well-known, most recent innovations have largely been around preprints, but not solely. And so you'll hear a little bit about preprints and PRC. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with PRC. It means publish, review, curate. And it's the idea that you have a publish moment, which is the preprint moment, where content is shared. You have a review moment, which is the R, which comes after the publication, and then curation, which is a kind of like accumulation of reviews and published material in a curative moment. So these are all processes that have previously been held within the walls of journals. And I think you can see PRC potentially as a way of deconstructing journals. But it's not the only thing that's happening. While journal processes have been sort of deconstructed in this manner, in this moment, there are other really interesting experiments taking place. And you'll hear some of those as well. So PRC is one of the most important experiments, emergent workflows, emergent processes at the moment, I believe. It holds a lot of interesting challenges and value for the sector. It has a tension with journals, which is also interesting. But there are other emergent models as well. And mostly these things are researcher-driven from the bottom up or scholar-led processes, which are another two terms that sort of, I think, are very important in this moment as well. Anyway, so that's enough from me. Each of the panelists will have 7 or 8 minutes to talk, and then we'll see if we've got some time for discussion, and I'll leave them each to introduce themselves before they present. So, I'll hand it over to Neil.
Hi everyone, my name is Neil Davies. I'm a researcher, a biologist, a field biologist, work in genetics. But I'm also an affiliate of the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, so I work for the University of California, Berkeley. And I'm an administrator. I run a research infrastructure, particularly a research station, a field station. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work we've been doing to try and publish research outputs much quicker and from earlier up in the value chain. So just a little background on what we do. You know, we're living in a period that's unprecedented, probably in the history of our planet. And so with rapid change, biodiversity loss, climate change, and unprecedented in the sense it's being driven by one species, there's never been a century where it's more important and interesting to study the Earth, from molecules to society, from very local places on the planet to the whole planet itself. So that's what we do. I mentioned I work on genetics. You can't get DNA information from satellites. You have to physically access the world, particularly biodiversity. So we do this largely supported through field facilities, and this is just marine stations around the world. There are over 800 of them, which are infrastructures that support scientists and other scholars for accessing, in this case, the ocean, the coastal ocean. I'm responsible for 2 of those dots, and I grew up near here, but now I live on this side of the world, which, as you can see, gives you a slightly different perspective. And I live in French Polynesia now, which is a massive exclusive economic zone of 5 million square kilometers, about the size of Europe. More particularly, the 2 stations I'll mention are on the island of Moorea and Tetiaroa, just off the coast of Tahiti in French Polynesia. So I'm the director of this research station, the University of California's Gump South Pacific Research Station on Moorea, and I'm also a science director for another research lab on this private atoll, Tetiaroa, which is supported by the Brando, an exclusive luxury resort. So two quite different business models behind them, but both doing very similar research. And we support researchers who come to the place, mainly, and do studies in all kinds of disciplines. And what's really important for us is what happens if the information about the samples and data that are gathered at our field stations, at our facilities, this applies on land as well as in the sea, if that information is lost as it travels down the research value chain, and more value is added later, but it's really important that that information is kept, some of the contextual information is kept with those samples and data, and that it's shared back to the place where they came from. Because if that information doesn't follow those samples and data downstream users and reusers are unaware of some really critical contexts, both scientific and social and legal. And also the places that this information is about miss out on getting that knowledge back. And that also inhibits the priming of the pump for the next round of research. And also, as a director of a research station, we don't get the credit necessarily that we've contributed to the publications that happen way downstream of us. So the global open science infrastructure, which I imagine we're all pretty familiar with, can help solve a lot of these problems. And it relies on fair data, which I don't imagine I need to go into details of what that is. And it's a very machine-centric scientific set of principles, which are really important. But take care, because open data are not always fair in the sense of justice and equity, and the ethical, legal, and social ramifications justify some extra friction in data sharing. So we want to make things available as quickly as possible, but not at any cost. And so one example of that is indigenous peoples have interests and rights over the data and information about the places that they've traditionally stewarded. And so these principles are more people-centric, and they're equally important in how we do science and particularly how we use science. So I've been involved in the last few years in a project we called the Fair Island Project, which is about how to operationalize those principles in a place-based research setting, using these two islands and these two research stations as our use cases. I'm basically working on a social technological infrastructure, so there's two components to this work. On the social side, we've been developing place-based data policies, the sort of social and legal aspects around the intent of the research. And so, for example, we have this draft policy, which you can see. One of the important points in it is the researchers at the place agree to share metadata and pre-publication data amongst that community of researchers. And one way we've been able to do that is by making everyone who works in their own specialist disciplines part of a bigger project. And the project in this case of the place is we're building a digital twin. We called it a digital avatar when we started this back in 2013, but digital twin is the more popular term these days. A digital representation of that place to enable scenarios and modeling, predictive modeling of different outcomes under different activities. So what if we do this, what would happen? That's obviously really important for management, so this contributes to the stewardship of the place. And that gives everyone a common project, and we have to mobilize data and knowledge across different fields in order to address these sustainability governance questions. The second part is more technological of that infrastructure, and there we've been looking at, we have this great global scientific open science infrastructure, but we need to articulate with it from local settings. And so we need local tools that help people to access those resources. Currently we have, in field stations, we have project management systems. Lead investigators submit applications, we process them, we accept their project, they come, they do their work, we hope to get a report back at the end. The weaknesses of the systems we currently use, they tend to be closed, they don't really use identifiers, and they're disconnected from the downstream work. So we've been trying to make these fairer, so that these systems can help produce more fair data and more fair samples. And we've also been working with a nonprofit organization called Local Context, which represents indigenous communities and indigenous data sovereignty, and they've developed some really fascinating new tools for applying labels to data and artifacts that reflect the rights and interests of the indigenous community related to those artifacts and data. And so that's really implementing the CARE principles. So working with Kotai as a platform, we've been developing this sort of self-publication tool where we can publish research outputs from very early, in fact, before the project even gets started, to publish things much quicker, make them available, and including both the scientific information and the social and legal context in which that study takes place. Okay. So we are basically building journals. You can call them journals for the two sites that enable us to leverage the global open science infrastructure. A station director acts as an editor, so these are familiar to most people, so it's easy to communicate this. Okay, now I'm acting as an editor. Someone applying to do work is an author, and then we have them reviewed, not just by scientific review, but also legal review and social, cultural reviews. So people log in, they get a unique identifier to identify themselves. They submit their manuscripts. This is all very familiar. The director has this nice dashboard where I can see where things are in the process. This is all obviously very, very familiar, but new to us in the way that we use this. And then the applicant, the author, ends up, if their project's approved, they get their landing page is published. And in this case, here you can see these labels I mentioned, which shows prior informed consent from the local community in this case. And then I can package those up and publish them in my journal of my station, which I use to promote what we do. And the final piece is that because these projects get unique identifiers, then they're linked into the global scientific infrastructure. We can harvest back all of the things that are produced from those projects back to the place. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Omar Oaya. I don't have any slides, so you're going to have to just follow my voice. I work for the Western Central African Research and Education Network. So we call it WACRAN for short. So I just need to give you a bit of some background. So we've been talking about, I think I've had a couple of talks on bibliodiversity, inequality. So that's where we come from, that perspective. We build research networks. So over the last 10, 11 years, we have been promoting these structures called National Research Education Networks in Africa. If you're in the UK and you know JISC, then you might have known Janet before it folded into JISC. So Janet is, so we interconnect those sort of networks. So these are countries that have academic institutions and research centers interconnected in networks. And my organization interconnects those networks in Western Central Africa. So we have this project called Africa Connect, and in the last 11 years, we have managed to set up 38 of these networks in countries across Africa and interconnected about 25 of them. So as we did this about 8 years ago, the researchers, there was more requirement for publishing infrastructure from the researchers. So we started to connect to this area. Before that, it was really networking, cloud computing infrastructure, and the above-the-net service that is publishing had not been touched. So when we started, we got involved with a number of organizations, COCO, IFUL, which you might know, and some others, to try and see if we could look at this from first principles. We started to encounter different colors of open access. We didn't really understand it at that point. So we got our communities together to try and understand what they really wanted. So what kind of emerged out of that were certain principles for open infrastructure that we kind of identified. Simple things. One, infrastructure needed to live in Africa. It needed to be easy to use. They wanted to have facilities to sort of, I think the lithographic work for the journals. Reviewing had to be easy, had to support multiple kinds of reviews. So we took those requirements and looked at what the NRENs, we could support the NRENs at, and kind of followed the PRC model. We thought that was the most useful considering the issues that some of them were political, geopolitical, that we could not resolve, but we wanted to be able to provide a service for those users. So essentially provide infrastructure for our communities. So what we eventually ended up with was our version of the PRC model. So we have had a few years of these institutions building out repositories. Not preprint repositories, regular generalized open access repositories. From an NREM point of view, we really couldn't see the difference between these repositories and preprint repositories. They all seem to be exactly the same, and we're basically bound by function. So we thought we would leverage that low-hanging fruit. We had repositories already. What we would do would build what we had identified as a gap, the reviewing infrastructure on top of that. So communities could deposit their articles wherever they chose, but we're able to use this platform for reviewing. So we are trialing that out now. We have a couple of groups. We have a group that have formed a coalition for open access publishing in public health. So these are regional organizations in Africa, the West, there's one in West Africa, one across in the South and the East, and another group in the North. They have come together to use this platform. And there's an organization actually based in the UK called People's Praxis, which is actually running a course on open review for public health. We intend to do exactly the same in the other areas that are topical for us as NRENs: climate, agriculture, and weather monitoring in the next year. And in that process, sort of try out and push out these infrastructures. One thing I thought I would mention about how we're doing this. So right now it's sort of manual. We intend that the articles are deposited in the repository, and then the cohort or the group that's using the open review platform goes to the platform and basically takes the articles from there. But we are working with the COA. I don't know if you know COA. COA is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, which has a project called COA Notify, which allows the repositories to communicate with the open review platform. In that way, the researcher is able to trigger a request for a review that's automated, that allows us to, we're using Kotahi, by the way, same as 1 minute, same as Neil for the open review platform. So the researcher triggers the request from his article in the repository. It creates a message that notifies the editor on the reviewer platform, or the group in the review platform. And when the reviews are done in Kotahi, then that's linked back to the repository, so creating the communication between both. I think that's enough, yeah. Thank you very much. The lights. Those lights are bright.
Do you want your phone back? There you go. Right. Thanks very much. I'm Fiona Husson. I'm the head of publishing at eLife. And I guess, we talk about accelerating scientific discovery at eLife. So that's how we view publishing. How can we use it to facilitate the scientific community in order to move faster? So a little bit about eLife, for those that don't know. It was established in 2012 as an independent not-for-profit. It was originally created to produce a gold open access journal that would compete with Science, Nature, and Cell. I don't think it quite got there, but it's a really nice journal that people in the community are very fond of. It publishes a lot of life science and now some medical science content. It's always been at the forefront of open science and open access. But as an organization, we have moved on to what we do now is we publish review preprints. So from the end of January 2023, we moved from a sort of traditional publishing model to a model where we review and assess preprints. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But as an organization, we also develop open source platforms with others like Kotahi, and that functions to support the review and dissemination of research. But we have communities teams as well. We have a community team that works with early career researchers across the globe to educate them, to help them understand publishing, to be involved in the open science movement. And so that's a really important part of the function of eLife as well. But, you know, our funders don't want us just to be a sort of standard journal. They want us to change the scientific publishing landscape. So, you know, us just being a nice journal, publishing nice content is not what they want and not what they invest in. So going back to the idea that we're reviewing preprints. So just a little bit about preprints. There's obviously, you know, arXiv has been publishing since 1991. But obviously we now have a lot of different preprint servers, including bioRxiv and medRxiv. There was, as we know, there was a bit of an acceleration of people preprinting during the COVID pandemic. The advantages of preprints are that it's immediate access to that research. Now, if you're a scientist, I used to be a scientist, you don't really wait for somebody else to say that that article is useful, the research is good. As soon as you see a paper, the lab, you know, tears it apart, tears it to pieces, essentially. So what's really good about preprints is whilst that peer review process is really useful and advantageous for everybody else in the research field, if you're the lab in that field that works on the same thing, you can, you know, take apart that paper without having to wait, you know, 9 months or whatever for it to be published. You don't need that. That peer review is required for other people in the community, but not necessarily the labs that the paper would be sent to get peer reviewed. You could do that yourself. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. There's that immediate access to research from other groups. And generally, you would see that normally at scientific conferences in the past, where people would talk about the research before it was formally published. But of course, preprints are free at the moment to deposit and access, and the whole process is controlled by authors. And by that, I mean that publishing a preprint is not controlled by a journal, not controlled by an editor. It's controlled by the authors themselves. They can decide when they want to socialize their research. Of course, the disadvantages is they've not been reviewed. So for people outside the immediate field, you know, that peer review process is really crucial and important. And it helps others contextualize and assimilate that research. It's not curated. By curated, I mean a stamp of approval from somebody that you trust, an organization you trust, a society you trust, for example. So curation is an important part to enable people to say, hey, this is, you know, the structure of the ribosome. This is a really important piece of research. You know, have a look at this. So not surprisingly, eLife, we do a lot of perception surveys. We did one in July. This is people that come to our website, so it's not particularly surprising, but the percentage of people reading preprints was over 96%, and over 30% of the literature is read, preprints are read by the average individual. So I think that's just important to think about, and it's probably a lot changed in the last 10 years. So what is PRC? I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I know that the others in the panel have talked about this, but it's a publish, review, curate model, and it breaks the publishing process down into discrete parts. And those discrete parts can be done individually. And a lot of organizations are working on individual components of that. So publish, i.e. you're publishing in a preprint server or an open access repository. Obviously you want all that content to have DOIs, to be discoverable, etc. The review process, now this is where there's a lot of really interesting innovation happening, for example, with review commons, pre-review, etc. It's reviewing content outside of a journal system. But the reviews should always be standalone contributions to the work. That's interesting parts of the scholarly record, they should be open and transparent. And then curation, different people interpret curation in different ways. It can take many forms. It's that sort of trust marker from somebody that you trust. It can be an evaluation. It can be collection into, a collection of articles. It can be even an acceptance into journals. Now, you'll have seen the Plan S towards responsible publishing proposal from them. And they talk quite a lot about the publish, review, curate process, and that it being a scholarly-led, a community-driven publishing process. What they mean by scholarly-led is that the scholars have choice throughout the system. They have choice when to publish. They have choice where to review. Oh. So quickly, this is the eLife model. We've had over 10,000 submissions since launch. Our model is a flavor of the PRC model. We send out our articles in terms of there's a decision whether to review. At that point, there's a peer review and consultation, and the articles are given an eLife assessment. The eLife assessment is our curation piece of the model. It uses standard terminology to talk about the significance of the work and the strength of the evidence. The author can respond to those public peer reviews and the assessment, and then we publish what's called a reviewed preprint. Now that contains the manuscript, the assessment, and the public reviews. And that type of article is now accepted by some funders as part of research assessment, has DOI, CC BY, it can be indexed in Google Scholar, etc. At that point, the authors choose, and this is the important part, we no longer have an accept-reject decision. The authors choose at that point what to do with their manuscript. Remember, it's still a preprint in the metadata with the cross-ref schema. The authors can revise it in accordance and get an updated review and assessment. They can decide that this is the final version of the article. It's been reviewed, it's been assessed. It's an integrated article with those criteria. Or they can send it to another journal. And we found that we see some of those articles appearing in other journals. So given that I've run out of time, I'm just going to leave it there. But if you do want to talk to me about eLife's publishing model, please just let me know. This is driven by our community. It's driven by the scientists that we talk to. They fundamentally think that the people that we talk to think that the system is broken, and that us as a publishing community need to do better to recognize their voice in this whole process. And that's part of what we're trying to do at eLife. So thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Stephen Pinfield, Professor of Information Services Management at the University of Sheffield and a Senior Research Fellow in the Research on Research Institute, RORI. And I'd like to talk to you about MetaRAW, Meta Research Open Review, which is a new peer review platform currently in development, which is implementing the Publish, Review, Curate model, and which is a joint initiative of RORI and AMOS, the Association for Interdisciplinary Meta-Research and Open Science. And it's going to be a peer review venue which serves the meta-research community, the research on research community. I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the practical details of implementing PRC in MetaRAW, and also talk through, also briefly, what that means and how we're approaching some of the conceptual issues to which PRC gives rise. For example, a key question in the PRC model, compared with the conventional publishing model, is what the curate function looks like where publish happens before review. And that's an interesting one, so I'd like to talk through what that looks like in our implementation of PRC. When publishing in the conventional model, curation is bound up with publishing selected content. That's the curation function. Okay, so some practical details then about MetaRAW. It's to serve, as I've said, the meta-research community, covering the disciplines that are listed there. I won't read them out. And also including topics that are listed there, from scientific practices to scientometrics and so on. It's due for launch in November this year, and we're currently in a testing and pilot phase using the Katahi software. And we're now processing some early submissions, so there will be some content there when we launch in November. We've appointed an editorial team and also 2 editors-in-chief, Ludo Valtman from Leiden University and Catherine Zeiler from Boston University. And accompanying the implementation of MetaRaw, we are surrounding it with a research and evaluation project to look at how it's used. And MetaRaw is, in fact, a case study, if you like, of a larger research program that's going on within RORI about the future of peer review. Of course, MetaRaw in some ways responds to some of the challenges created by the conventional publishing process, which looks very familiar, something like this, where an article is submitted, it undergoes closed peer review, and then it's published. However, that nice, neat line sometimes looks something more like this, where we go through a period of submission and reject. And that can take a very long time, rather like the animation for this slide. It can lead to inefficiencies, or at least redundancies in the system, with multiple reviews being carried out on the same paper. And also, it isn't rewarding for one of the key participants in this whole process, which is the reviewers, whose work is largely hidden. So the question arises, how can we make this process more rapid, more efficient, and more rewarding? And so MetaRaw is one attempt to address those questions, where the process looks something like this within the PRC model, where publication happens on a preprint server, and then the author submits that preprint for peer review by giving us a link to it. We carry out open peer review on the paper with the reviews published, and the identities of the authors, we encourage them to also sign their reviews, but there is an option for anonymity. And then the curation takes the form of editorial assessment by MetaRaw editors. Of course, after that, the author is then free to submit their work to a journal, and we're currently working with a number of journals to strike agreements where they take the MetaRaw reviews into consideration, so we can avoid, where possible, duplication of reviewing. That's work undergoing at the moment. So just in summary then, how this affects the PRC model, and dealing with each of them in turn in reverse order, because as I said, the curate function is perhaps the most interesting conceptually here, where curation involves, in essence, selecting, arranging, and endorsing. And that's true of all publishing models, selecting, arranging, and endorsing. In the conventional model, presenting as publications outputs which have been selected as worthy of attention, if you like. Here, curation is related to editorial commentary, not attached to a binary accept or reject decision. And so the emphasis then on peer review is a constructive one to improve the article, which is only part of the emphasis when it's associated with accept or reject. Review reports become part of the publication package with their own DOIs, and which are made publicly available, so the authors of the review reports become part of the public scholarly communication discourse, and their work is recognized. And publish is provided in this model by another provider, or providers, preprint servers, who are separated from the review process, giving it more flexibility. So that's our approach to deconstructing the journal. It's just one approach, but rather it's not so much a deconstruction approach, more a reconstruction or a recombination approach, and we'd be very interested to hear the response of the community. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you to the panelists. We had just a short amount of time. There's a lot of content to get through here, as you can see. So I really want to thank everyone for keeping within those parameters. That was awesome. And it means that we have reserved a little bit of time, 10 minutes in fact, for discussion. And for this, I'd like to throw it out to the audience, if you like, if there's anyone with any questions. There's one hand here, and then we'll come to Ian after that, and just get some conversation going. If you could introduce yourself and then ask.
Hi, I am Emily Chenette. I'm the editor-in-chief of PLOS ONE. Thank you so much for this really interesting overview of all of the different initiatives that seek to address these really common pain points in publishing. I do have a question around research integrity. So currently at PLOS, one of the things that helps us resolve post-publication and pre-publication publication ethics cases is that we have access to that full review publication record. So we know who the reviewers were, if there were conflict of interest, and things like that. And I'm just curious how we can reconcile a move to kind of this a la carte publishing process where we publish, then review, and curate with the responsibility of the final journal, to the integrity of the content that they publish. If they're not responsible for administering the review process, or they may not know the identity of reviewers, how can we ensure that the content is reliable and trustworthy?
I might throw that one to Fiona, perhaps, for a response.
Well, I think that, if you sort of move, I think one of the things that we have to do is work with the preprint servers in order to make sure that a lot of those checks are happening upstream. I think that's clearly a problem. If you're reviewing preprints, then you're taking them straight from the preprint server and then going through the process. Of course, before we publish articles as a version of record, we do all those checks so that by the time that it ends up being published, all of those things have happened. But that's not that, we admit that that's not an ideal process. It would be better to happen upstream. There's many things that we're trying to think about in terms of ensuring that there's badges on particular articles, for example, like open science badges, if they've had research integrity checks within a different system. We're trying to look at all of that as part of the whole process. But I agree that we have to solve different parts of the process at different times, and that's definitely an issue that we need to look at.
I'll try and keep it moving because we have a few minutes, so we'll just keep maybe one response, one question, try and get as many questions as possible. Ian?
Thank you. I'm Ian Mulvaney. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the British Medical Journal. Thank you to the whole panel. That was a really great set of sessions. My question is for you, Neil. I'm really interested in hearing about the care principles. I have to admit, I didn't know about those before. I think they're really powerful. BMJ, we get patients as reviewers, so this idea of increasing equity is so important. My question is, do you see a role for publishers in policing those principles, or is that a researcher's job? Do you have any guidance on how you've seen that work well, and anything we should take away from that, on how we can help make those work better?
Yeah, sure. Well, the care principles, as I mentioned, have come from indigenous communities, have developed them. They're a technological tool in the sense that they've been applied through this biocultural and traditional knowledge labels, which are an extra legal approach. So a lot of these artifacts are already in museums, collections around the world that came from indigenous communities. So it's a response to that to layer on. You can apply a label, it's already in the Library of Congress or wherever it is. You can apply a label to it to say this came from our community, this is what what its traditional context is, this is how we would like it to be used, which may or may not include things like it shouldn't be sold, but it's not legally binding in this case, partly because it's after the act. So what we're so we're working with that, and as I mentioned, the Local Context is a non-profit organization that maintains that. So we're working with them to see, well, can we apply these before it happens? So rather than having to try and fix, there's obviously a lot of legacy issues, how can we build into the research process ethical research where researchers contact local communities and start to co-produce. So it really opens a dialogue between a scientist and other stakeholders locally, and applying these labels in advance. And then those are supposed to, actually getting to the previous question, track all the way down. You know, this metadata follows it and should appear in the final journal article. So the provenance is very clear, and the permissions were also, you know, clearly demonstrated.
One last question, I think, was up here. We have 2 minutes left.
Hi, I'm Bernie from OASPA, and maybe Fiona's slightly answered this, so sorry if this is not useful. I just wanted to invite Fiona and maybe Stephen as well to talk about maybe one or two problems you've encountered in the models and lessons you've learned, things you've changed. Because although we know rankings can be reductive and ways of being binary, good, bad, they are useful sometimes. And I've been confused when I've looked at some PRC models, so I'd like to hear about things you've learned, changed, problems. Thank you.
And perhaps Omo as well may wish to comment on this.
I'll go first. I think perhaps the curation piece of the model is perhaps something that's less understood than other parts of the model. And I think that is always going to evolve. You're going to look at it and see what parts of that are working. Have we got the right terminology? Are we doing using it in the right way? Consistency across an editorial board of 800 people is quite difficult. And so we work very hard to ensure consistency. But I think one of the things that we always think about in the terms of Curate, that these should never be final judgments. Unlike a normal journal process where it's accept, reject, a curation is a curation at that point in time. You can come back in 3 years and actually say, well, actually, that needs an updated curation. And I think that's the interesting part of the model that we could think about. We're not doing that yet, but I think that's definitely something that we want to think about. But obviously, any terminology is, objective from whoever's doing that. And so I think we've kind of struggled a little bit with that, but we're trying to improve it, and it'd be interesting to see how others are finding that curation piece and what they're learning from it.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. I'm very conscious we've got a red countdown. I'm going to wonder what happened when it gets to 0. But anyway, so yeah, we've got similar kinds of challenges. Just to mention 2 things. I agree that integrity is a major challenge here, and one of the responses to that, I agree with Fiona, is very much all the different actors involved have to take this seriously, including preprint servers. Interesting, I've just done a separate research project talking to preprint servers about their moderation approaches, and we're just publishing 2 papers on that, which I've submitted to preprint servers, and they're currently being moderated. So it's all very meta, but that I agree is very important. It's an issue we've got our eye on. The other major challenge that I just pick out, because there are lots of them, but I just pick out, is the one around people wanting to be involved in this kind of thing, but then saying, yeah, but I've got, in metrics, I've got to hit, I've got promotion, and I've got to submit my high impact factor journal publication list. I've got my early career colleagues who've got careers to think of, and therefore so it's all this stuff around the incentives and reward structures. And so it's not just about getting the infrastructure around open science right. It is very much about addressing those incentive and reward structures. Really big challenge, but it's absolutely essential in this area.
Omo, would you like the last word before lunch?
I was just going to say that we've recognized some of this. So we're not in the same field. We're end-to-end. So we have this initiative called LeapSense, that's open science, that we've been working with other experts. And when you talk about incentives, we've been working with the likes of Quora and Dora, sort of taking that on board. And we think that, we're talking about leadership in the academic space. So these are conversations that are ongoing. So some issues that are not common to this environment. You talk about DOIs, same here. We can't afford DOIs. So these are also issues that we're talking about. So this, in terms of incentives and how that the policy will work around PRC, we have to just think thinking from scratch.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you. I think that's our time. Thanks to the panelists. It was awesome. And I'm sure any of them would be up for discussing things after, before lunch.
Yes, so thank you all the panellists. It's been an absolutely fascinating session. My name's Sophia Anderton, and I'm one of the ALPS directors. And if you are a member of ALPS, or as an organisation as a member of ALPS, please do stay for the AGM. That is taking place in this room now. Don't run away for lunch. Please do stay. As an incentive for staying, there will be lunch available. You're not going to miss out. There'll be some that will be available just outside here after the session. So please do stay for the AGM. We'll be hearing about everything that's happening with ALPS over the next year, including some really exciting updates from the training committee. So do stay, and thank you again to the panel.